Thank you for being here. I know it's still a little bit early. We're at least not the first session of the day, so we are very happy to have you here. And my understanding is that we like to start on time in the world of law enforcement, so we want to get this show on the road. So welcome. You have come to Comprehensive Guidance on Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. This is a session that we are presenting, and we are glad to recognize that we are able to do this because of the support of the COPS Office, the Community-Oriented Policing Services of the United States Department of Justice. There's a 2-year grant that this is being done under the auspices of. So my name is Brian Corr. I am the president of NACOL, the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. And I am here with a pretty incredible panel. We have, to my immediate left, Cameron McElhenney, who is the Director of Training and Education for NACOL. She's from Indianapolis, Indiana. She first was involved in civilian oversight as a community member who wanted to help make policing more responsive in her community, went on to become a volunteer and then staff person for NACOL. To her left, we have Michael Viteroulis, who is our millennial. He is a hotshot data researcher. He is from New York City and has been working with us for almost 2 years as our research fellow as part of the grant from the COPS Office. To his left is Nick Mitchell. Nick is the independent police monitor for the city and county of Denver, Colorado. In that capacity, he does oversight both of the police department and of the sheriff's department. So he's doing both law enforcement and correctional oversight. He originally comes out of New York as a transplanted Denverite and has built an organization which is incredibly good at both accountability but also outreach to community and building bridges between community members, helping them understand the nature of policing and law enforcement, and helping law enforcement understand the nature of community in that very specific context. And last but certainly not least, if you're familiar with Tucson, Arizona Chief Chris Magnus, you notice he's had a little transformation. Chief Magnus was unfortunately at the last minute not able to join us, but we are very lucky to have his Chief of Staff, Mike Silva. Mike Silva is an attorney. He also has a background in law enforcement as military police, and he has graciously agreed to step in. And we're lucky because he actually also has extensive experience working in Tucson with the Civilian Oversight Board. So he actually is the right man at the right time for this job. So please, if we can have a brief round of applause for our panelists. I really just want to take a moment to frame why this is important to our organization, NACOL, and then each of our panelists will say a little bit about why they're here, and then we'll go more into the content. So it really is an honor to be presenting at IACP 2018. This is probably the world's premier gathering of law enforcement professionals, and we recognize that it's not a small feat to have the opportunity to speak with all of you. And as I said, we really do want to acknowledge the COPS Office of the Department of Justice. We received this grant under the Community Policing Development Program in 2016, and also, again, we are very honored to be able to do that work. And I want to thank COPS Director Phil Keith and Community Policing Director Rob Chapman for their support of this work. Within the context of what we in this country have been calling 21st century policing, and really looking at procedural justice and legitimacy, I would say that a very important part of that in many communities already, and I think in the future many more, will be civilian oversight. It takes many forms. We'll talk about that in a bit. But one of the things that we're glad to be able to present is that it's not just anecdotal that civilian oversight can make a difference. There's a growing field of practice. We have a growing field of research and study. And this study and evidence-based work is what we want to present to you in the context of additional information about civilian oversight. And I do want to say that if you're thinking that in 90 minutes we will give you comprehensive guidance on civilian oversight, that might be a little much. It might take about an hour and 45 minutes. But in all seriousness, that's the name of our grant, and we hope that for those of you who have civilian oversight, this is helpful. For those of you who are looking towards it or expecting it, we really do believe it will be helpful to you because when this project is done, it will be a comprehensive set of guidance about oversight for law enforcement, for community, for anyone who's interested. And so finally, I would just say that for those of us in civilian oversight, sometimes we're seen as the enemy by law enforcement, sometimes we're seen as the enemy by community members, but ultimately, we all have the same goal. We all want just and peaceful communities. So it's in that spirit that we come to you today, and I want to now turn it over to Cameron McElhenney to start the content of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So just a brief couple of minutes of introduction. So as Brian mentioned, I came to Civilian Oversight as a community board member who helped review complaints of what was then called the Indianapolis Police Department, now IMPD. And I did so in 1998. So I've been involved in the field for a while, and in that capacity, I have recognized the need to train people doing this work, and felt very fortunate that I could be involved with NACOL and work myself through NACOL as first a volunteer and then a staff member and now the Director of Training and Education, so that I could make sure that all parts of the community, and let me just say, when I talk about community, I talk about the overarching community. In my world, community exists of police, civilians, academics. I mean, it's a collection of people that come together to make community. It's not just law enforcement here and community that sits over here. So please know that as I speak today and in the future, that is the perspective that I come from. Over the years of working with oversight practitioners and efforts to professionalize and standardize the field, we've also known that there needs to be a commitment to consistent and professional training, and that's why we wanted to make sure that we had a project that could put together guidance that worked for everyone, people doing the work, people who were affected by the work, and so that's what we're coming here to tell you today. And I will say that Brian mentioned jokingly that you probably won't have a complete comprehensive guidance on civilian oversight in 90 minutes. However, I hope that by us being here, that we will be able to establish a relationship that allows you to know that we're available as a resource. We work with a lot of communities and civilian oversight agencies throughout the country and the world to give them information that they need, but we're also here for law enforcement to better understand the work that oversight is doing in your communities. So this presentation is 90 minutes, but please know that we're available in the future for other information as well. With that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Vitaroulis, and I'm a NACOL's Research Fellow. For the past 2 years, I have been traveling the country speaking to civilian oversight practitioners, law enforcement, union representatives, and community members to better understand the way that civilian oversight works in their jurisdiction. I'll be speaking a little bit more about the content and the deliverables of the grant, but I just want to say that this grant is a great opportunity for NACOL to present to external stakeholders some of the mechanics and underlying foundations of civilian oversight and some guidance on practices that are considered effective in the field.
Good morning, Nick Mitchell. Thank you. I'm also really appreciate Brian's comments. Very honored to be here presenting to all of you. As Brian said, I'm the independent monitor of the Denver Police Department and Denver Sheriff's Department. I plan to talk with you about a pretty significant partnership between my office and the Denver Police Department to improve relationships between youth and law enforcement in Denver, and the impacts that we think that has had on our community and on the police department. So thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Okay. Good morning. On behalf of Chief Magnus, I would like to apologize for him that he's unable to be here. He took ill, as they mentioned this morning. So I'm here, sort of the C team, if you will. I think actually a great way to sort of set the tone for the morning is kind of a shout out to someone that's, I think, a fundamental to policing, Sir Robert Peel. He said many years ago, the police are the public, the public are the police. And I think if we sort of frame everything that we talk about today in that way, we'll get to the right place.
All right, so I'm going to sit down here for this part. The next thing I want to do is just do a very brief overview of the history of civilian oversight and then talk about the nature of oversight. So civilian oversight in the United States in a form that might be at least somewhat recognizable to you really starts in 1928. It goes back to the Committee on Constitutional Rights in Los Angeles, where the LA Bar Association was actually working outside of any official governmental structure to review complaints about misconduct by the Los Angeles police 90 years ago. I think most people don't realize, so that's almost halfway back to Sir Robert Peel. And it does have a long history, but again, it was a very small start. In 1931, as many of you know, the Wickersham Commission recommended that there should be some disinterested agency to combat what it called lawlessness in law enforcement. Obviously, that era, 1931, the Great Depression, after Prohibition, there were a lot of issues that were starting to create systemic problems that were going beyond individual officers, bad apples doing something. And so that was the first real national recognition that there needed to be something done outside of the structure of law enforcement agencies to address these issues. By 1948, so now we're up to 70 years ago, the first official civilian oversight board was formed in Washington, D.C. And that Washington, D.C., as we all know, has a little interesting hybrid because it's not a state, it's a city under federal control. And unfortunately, that was deemed not to be effective. It operated for almost 20 years, from 1948 to 1964. And in that time, it only reviewed 54 cases. And as you can imagine, there were probably more than 54 people in 20 years that had some unhappiness with their encounter with the forerunner of the Metropolitan Police Department in D.C. When we get into the era of what would be more similar to what we have today, you have to go to 1958. So now we're 60 years ago, where the Police Advisory Board was formed in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's not the current board that we have. It was abolished in 1969, and unfortunately, everyone agreed that it had done little to have a positive impact on police-community relations. So as we move into the more modern era and agencies that still exist, we start with 1970, where the Kansas City, Missouri Office of Citizen Complaints started. It still exists, a relatively small office in a city of a few 100,000 people, but it has for almost 50 years been part of the community, building relationships and addressing issues of concern to the community, and has had a positive impact by all accounts. 3 years later, in '73, the Police Review Committee was established in Berkeley, California. And this was an important milestone because it was the first time where voters in a referendum said, we want to establish civilian oversight in our community. Those of you familiar with Berkeley, California, much like Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I live, it's a very active community, and citizens get involved. City Council takes action, but it actually has continued and, again, has been an effective way to bridge that divide sometimes between what people see as community and police, and I wholeheartedly agree with Cameron's comments. And it continues to build new ways of dealing with issues that come up. So by 1980, to kind of pick this up, there were 13 civilian oversight entities in operation. By the year 2000, there were more than 200. And so as society has evolved, as we've faced more and more challenges around community issues in economics, violent crime, racial issues, gender issues, of course there has been an increase in civilian oversight agencies being formed. And most recently in the era of Black Lives Matter, Me Too, we've seen new agencies formed and also existing agencies like Denver, San Francisco, New Orleans be revised. Charter amendments, referenda to reshape these agencies to better meet the needs of the current environment. And you're going to talk about the models. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over now to give you an oversight of the types of civilian oversight that we have in the United States.
So you may be wondering at this point how many civilian oversight agencies exist in the United States. There's somewhere between 150 to 200 in the US. Many of these were created in response to a local crisis involving problems with trust in local law enforcement. In a recent survey that NACOL did with the Office of Justice Programs, we found that about 11% of civilian oversight agencies today were created proactively before there was some local crisis involving the community and law enforcement. There are 3 broad models of civilian oversight. There are review-focused models, investigation-focused models, and auditor-monitor type models. And an increasingly new phenomenon are hybrid models, which combine certain elements of these types of oversight models and functions. So review-focused models, they typically involve civilian boards that are responsible for reviewing completed investigations done by the department. Many of them vote on a recommended disposition. They may issue a recommendation for discipline involving the officer if the complaint is sustained. These are the earlier types of civilian oversight models, which are really created to provide an opportunity for the community to give input on local policing matters. Can skip through. Investigation-focused models are part of the second wave of civilian oversight agencies. These became more prominent in the 70s and the 80s, and these are staffed by professional investigators who typically have a background in municipal investigations. They also receive training on local department policies and procedures. They'll conduct independent investigations of complaints filed by citizens, sometimes by officers, and from this point of departure, many of these models were created to increase public trust in the investigation process and reduce any perceived bias that may be involved with the Internal Affairs Department conducting the investigation. Auditor-monitor focused models are among the newer types of models. These are the fastest growing types of oversight agencies over the past 10 years. These agencies look at more systemic matters involving the police department. They may conduct audits of, for example, use of force investigations. Some of them perform monitoring, active monitoring of investigations being conducted by the police department. They may sit in on interviews and provide some sort of guidance on the direction of the overall investigation. They tend to issue robust reports involving policy recommendations that incorporate best practices in law enforcement and some of the concerns that have been relayed by the community. And finally, hybrid models. Like I said, this is an increasingly common phenomenon. Some of them incorporate elements of doing independent investigations, auditing certain elements of department policies and procedures, and reviewing certain cases. These were typically formed in response to restrictions imposed by local laws and union contracts that may necessitate a little bit more of a creative composition of the way that oversight works.
So over the years, as I've been doing training, I've heard quite a few arguments against civilian oversight of law enforcement. No one has any problem telling me exactly why there should not be civilian oversight of law enforcement. However, some of those reasons are based in the fear that you have someone judging the work that's being done without any idea of how the work should be done. So that's where training comes into effect. So if you have people doing civilian oversight who have a familiarization with law enforcement, the policies, the practices, and the procedures, some of those fears can be alleviated. For review boards, you have to have a commitment and make a priority training for the people who are doing the work, because they're civilians. When I was on a review board, I wasn't a police officer. I had no idea. However, the training was imperative for me to be able to better understand the cases that I was reviewing. So for review boards, you have to have members that are provided with the information that they need. For an investigative model, you have to have investigators that know and have been trained in investigative techniques. And for the auditor-monitor model, you have to have people doing the work who not only know the police policies and procedures and have investigative techniques that they've been trained on, they also need to know how to analyze data and how to do policy analysis and recommendation. So in order to make this training happen, we've worked in several different areas. So first of all, every city has an internal training mechanism that they can draw from. People doing the work need to rely on law enforcement academies, visits to law enforcement facilities, and ride-alongs. So law enforcement academies can teach them the same things that law enforcement are being taught. And in addition to an overview, there also needs to be time where, I guess we could call it menu training, where as a civilian review board member or someone working in another model, you see the same type of complaints come up frequently. It's very important to be able to say, and to admit, we are seeing this complaint and we need more training on how is an officer supposed to be performing this particular duty. And law enforcement needs to be able to say, we are more than happy to help you with that. That way you have a partnership of knowledge that helps then solve some of the problems of not knowing. The visits to law enforcement facilities, this would include jail, juvenile detention facilities, headquarters, the academy itself, so that you have a better understanding of the facilities that are coming up in complaints. Also, ride-alongs, one of the most valuable pieces of my training were ride-alongs. And these aren't ride-alongs once in a great while or 1 4-hour ride-along a year. I did at least a ride-along every quarter of the 6 years that I served on a review board, and that probably was not enough. But it helped me understand better what was happening on a daily basis in the lives and the jobs of officers. It also helped them understand that civilian oversight is not necessarily this angry citizen who's trying to do the work, that I was just someone that was there to help the community and bridge that gap. So those, I think, if your community is not insisting that those happen, that it absolutely needs to, in addition to all of the technical training that occurs. There's also some external training recommendations that we've come up with, in addition to the trainings on investigation techniques and video review techniques, many of which you can get here this week. I wish that these were more available to civilians doing the work, but we are working on that. There are several different things that NACOL has done. We have an annual conference, and in fact, we just finished it 2 days ago, where we brought together 500 civilian oversight practitioners from around the country and the world with over 31 sessions. And I think one of the most important pieces for all of you to know about that conference is that it is not knowledge in a vacuum. Many of our sessions include law enforcement on those panels so that we can bring as many perspectives to the table as possible. And that goes from sessions on analyzing lawsuits, less lethal practices and policies, to police unions and working with civilian oversight, where we had some members of the Police Officers Guild from King County and Washington State attend and give their perspective. And although I'm sure you can imagine there were some difficult conversations in there, it was incredibly helpful for everybody to sit and have the discussion that needs to be had. We also do regional training and networking events and webinars so that we can train civilian oversight practitioners on very specific techniques, and we often use law enforcement to do that as well. We've had some excellent sessions on CIT training, as well as things such as procedural justice and how it's being implemented in departments. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Nick, to talk a little bit more.
Thank you. So a lot of the discussion so far has been focused on, the models and how, the work gets done. And I think we've appropriately talked about, the complaint process. That's what people often think about when they think about civilian oversight. They think about citizens filing complaints, and some investigative process managed outside the police department or working with the police department to look into those complaints. And I think that's a really important piece of oversight. That's a part of most of these models that can be incredibly helpful to departments in terms of enhancing the legitimacy or the perceived legitimacy in the community of those investigations. But it's not what I want to talk about today, because I want you to think a little bit more broadly about oversight and what it might be able to help you with in your city. And I want to tell a story from my experience as the independent monitor in Denver. Because in 2013, we saw a huge spike in complaints being filed by young people and their family members about interactions with police officers that had gone badly for one reason or another. And we were hearing about this in all of the community meetings we were attending. We were seeing the complaints flooding into our agency. And we wanted to understand why, what was happening, and what we could do about it, partnering with the police department to sort of figure out, what were the commonalities in these interactions, these sort of negative interactions, what was prompting them, what kinds of behaviors by the young person, what kinds of behaviors maybe by the officer was escalating these interactions that always started out as being pretty low level. These were low level kinds of contacts that were escalating and resulting in arrests and sometimes uses of force and lots of concern in the community. So we did some analysis of the incidents. We worked hand in hand with the Denver Police Department. And what we found was sort of a persistent lack of communication or miscommunication on both sides of these interactions. What we saw is young people who did not really know how to interact with police officers successfully. Lots of young people who didn't have experience. Maybe they'd heard negative things about police officers, or they had seen someone in their family being arrested and they had formed some negative impression about what would happen if they were in contact with a police officer. And so they were refusing to provide information to the officers. They were refusing to comply with reasonable and lawful commands, almost as much based out of fear and a misunderstanding as anything more nefarious. And what we also saw was police officers who were misinterpreting some of the behavior they were seeing from the young people, or interpreting it as interpreting those behaviors as indicators of criminality, perhaps, rather than just kids behaving in ways that were, I didn't always make great decisions as a teenager, and we saw this same sort of pattern playing out in incident after incident. And as an oversight agency, as we looked around in our community at who was training young people and who was training police officers about how to have more successful interactions, the answer was no one. That training was not available in our community. We surely had nonprofits that were training young people on their rights when in contact with police officers, but nothing about their responsibilities. We had a training academy in Denver that does tremendous work and provides lots of excellent training, but no real, not the same comprehensive focus that we thought was necessary on adolescent brain development and de-escalation techniques specific to working with young people. And so what we did as an oversight agency is we pulled together stakeholders from throughout our city, youth-serving organizations, religious organizations. We got local universities on board. The police department was very much on board. And we actually had 30, the Bar Association, we had about 30 stakeholder groups come together over a series of days and weeks and lengthy meetings to design a curriculum to improve the level, the capacity of young people in our community to interact with police officers and improve the kind of corresponding capacity of police officers to interact with young people. And we've had a program now in Denver for several years that has been extraordinarily successful. We hold day-long forums that move throughout the city. Each forum, they happen on Saturdays, usually has about 50 at-risk teenagers and about 10 police officers. There's a very clear curriculum that's set forth that involves each group is trained separately at the beginning of the day, and then they break out into small groups for facilitated discussions that are facilitated by community members, where we really work to kind of bridge the gap between police officers and young people in our community. The program is actually now being evaluated by the University of Colorado School of Public Affairs, and the preliminary data is very promising in terms of enhancing the trust of young people in police officers in our community. So we're looking forward to having that evaluation completed at the end of the year. So I guess that's just one example that I want you to think about when you hear about civilian oversight. It's not just the kind of complaint process and the things that you may normally associate with oversight. It's also having a potential partner which is receiving information from the community about trends and patterns, about the tension points, the pain points between the department and the community, who can help you partner to try and address those issues and get them fixed. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that I want to build upon something that Nick said there that's important from the agency perspective. I think even the language that we use when we sort of default to this idea of oversight, and I think it's really that's maybe a small component. Really, what we're talking about is a collaboration. If you're doing this right in your community, you are using a collaboration with whatever your entity is, whether it exists by way of municipal code, whether it's something that's purely political that comes from your mayor's office. The point here is that this is a resource that will allow you, your agency, to better serve the community. It will allow you to interface with your community in a way that's more meaningful to not just interest groups, but I think the larger community as well. So not that oversight is a bad term or the wrong term to use. I think that we have challenged our commanders and everyone in our agency to look at it more as an opportunity and a collaboration.
So we mentioned the grant project that we are working on currently, and so the information that I'm about to talk about will be finalized and ready for distribution in January of 2019. So this grant is putting together 4 different deliverables that we hope will be helpful. First, we put together, are currently finishing up 9 case studies of different cities throughout the country, including, let me get my notes so I don't forget anyone. The Cambridge Police Advisory and Review Board, the Indianapolis Citizen Complaint Board, Miami Civilian Investigative Panel, District of Columbia Office of Police Complaints, LAPD Office of Inspector General, the New Orleans Office of the Independent Monitor, and the Denver Office of the Independent Monitor. So these case studies are a comprehensive report on the history, the mechanisms and the procedures of each of those different types of agencies. We're also doing a report on the state of the field, which is a comprehensive overview of civilian oversight as it currently exists, with some history and evolution thrown in there for good measure. And it will also discuss the concepts and challenges associated with best practices and performance measurement, which is something that civilian oversight even though that first oversight mechanism started in 1928, we're still working on those pieces, and we're hoping that this project will help move us forward a bit on it. We're also going to put together a decision-making guidebook on establishing or strengthening civilian oversight mechanisms. And this, as I'm sure you are all familiar with, that civilian oversight, more often than not, tends to come into being out of a critical incident, and then everybody starts shouting that this is what we need, and it's not always necessarily a full picture of what's needed. So we are working to put together the information that and research that we've gathered about the different ways and different types of oversight that's been established, so that no one is having to reinvent the wheel. And so that when oversight is established, that it's effective, consistent, and produces accountability from the start, and not kind of as a project and experiment as you go along. We also are working on an interactive online toolkit, which is a web-based resource for agencies across the country, and is one of the pieces that I am very excited about, because this does not exist. Right now, there is nowhere you can go to actually see what oversight exists, what it's doing. It's enabling legislation, how big the cities are that it, or police departments are that it oversees. So with that, I'll let Mike talk a little bit more about the different components and the work he's been doing to research, the research behind it.
Thank you, Cami. So as Cami said, there are 4 deliverables involved in the project, and one of the primary parts is the case studies that we will be developing. We did 9 site visits in conjunction with the Police Foundation based in DC, and these agencies that we visited kind of speak to the level of diversity in terms of the oversight. Although we have 3 for each of these models, and none of them really work in the same way. There's great variety in the way that these organizations are set up, in the level of authority that they have, and the amount of resources that they have. So we have everything ranging from small investigative agencies to large monitors overseeing the work of large police departments. So yeah, that is the table there. I just wanted to talk about some of the newer phenomena that are occurring in civilian oversight. As everybody has been trying to kind of drive home, we are moving beyond a focus on just complaints. There is a big emphasis on collecting, analyzing, and assembling data in order to issue policy recommendations that are based on some of the local observations that the Civilian Oversight Agency and its analysts may have seen. A lot of these recommendations are based on policy research involving best practices in law enforcement. What are the best ways that we can write policies that are responsive to community needs? And they balance the needs between the community and the stakeholders. Access to department records is something that we're also focusing on in this report. Access to records is crucial for the work of a civilian oversight agency, but there's a great variety in terms of what is accessible to them and how. Auditor-monitor models typically have the most comprehensive level of access. They have back-end access to internal affairs. They can access the early warning system information, use of force data, and such. Review models tend to have just access to closed internal affairs cases and maybe some personnel files in order to reach a disciplinary recommendation in cases where they vote to sustain the allegations in the complaint. Accountability and evaluation requirements are also a new phenomenon that are occurring. Of course, the question is who will police the police, but who will oversee the overseers? So legislation is now increasingly including a requirement that the oversight agency be evaluated on an annual basis. This is done by a variety of stakeholders. In instances where there's a civilian component to the oversight system, sometimes the civilian board will conduct an evaluation of the work of the professional office. Municipal auditors or comptrollers are often responsible for issuing a report on the work done by the agency. In some cases, independent peer reviews by externally contracted researchers and firms are also part of that process, and it's an important part to increase legitimacy of the work of the agency itself, the oversight agency itself.
Excellent. I'm moving up here because I'm going to ask these guys a few questions, and so just to be transparent on our format, I want to engage them a little bit more, dig into some of these things, and then we're going to open it up because we really want to give you a chance to ask your questions. And I don't know, I'm from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Usually we get statement and answer, so we'll take statements as well. But we definitely want to hear your questions and address concerns, knowledge you may have, experiences you have, because this is really a chance for us to share with you and for us to hear from you and bring it back to our organization. But I guess first, let me just start with you, Cameron. What would you say would be a couple of key qualifications for people involved in oversight, and recognizing the diversity of models and people involved in that work?
Well, depending on the model, as you said, the key qualifications differ slightly. So for Civilian Review Board, which I think is probably the most concerning to law enforcement about how those boards are put together, I think that you need to make sure that there is a component of diversity, and that diversity is very wide-ranging. It is not just the color of the skin of the people on the board. It is about their cultural backgrounds, their financial situations. It needs to be diverse, because then one of the reasons that you have a Civilian Review Board is because it provides a piece of the community in the process. So you want to make sure the whole community is represented. But I also think that you need to make sure that once you have this selection of persons, that you make sure that they are willing and able to be trained on all of the information needed to do the job consistently and professionally. Professionally, that term has been kind of a point of contention in our organization sometimes, because people who are volunteer board members and members of the community want to make sure that there is a difference between the person who's hired by the city to do an oversight job and those who are doing it on a Civilian Review Board. When I use the term professionally, it doesn't matter whether you're a volunteer or a paid employee. One needs to do the job professionally, and to do that, they must have the training necessary. Now, in the case of investigative model or even audit or monitor model, I think that the key qualifications are also training, but there is a professional component of training. We do have a lot of investigators in the investigative model agencies who are former law enforcement, so they have very specific training on how investigations are done. There's also a large component of people who come from the private investigative background. And so the other key component is making sure, because sometimes those investigations happen differently. They have different methods sometimes, and so that there is a way to reconcile the two different manners and backgrounds. And then as far as an auditor and monitor model, I do think that really it takes all of the other components into account, but then also has a staff that is well adept at policy analysis and data analysis, so that they can actually look at the details of what's happening and then go forward and make policy recommendations.
All right, thank you. And actually, let me just ask the group here, to your knowledge, how many of you work in an agency or an environment where you have some form of civilian oversight? All right, that's actually pretty good, because in the United States, as you all know, we have approximately 18,000 law enforcement agencies and a couple hundred civilian oversight agencies. A lot of the big cities do have it, but many don't. So it's great to see so many people in this room who are familiar with it. So I'm expecting some questions, just warning you. Next, I want to ask Nick a question. One of the things that I hear a lot is, what is the best form of oversight? So what do you say when people ask you that, considering your various experiences?
Well, I'm not sure that there is a best form of oversight. I think these are tend to be organic institutions that grow out of particular local circumstances, and the the nature of the relationship between the community and the police department in in a particular region, and there's so much diversity in terms of the way communities are relating to their police departments. So I'm not sure that there is a best model. I think we surely have seen trends, as Mike talked about, the different waves. First the focus on the investigative model, and now it's auditor, inspector general model. But I'm not really sure that I can answer that with any kind of definitive answer.
Right. Nope. And Cameron, do you have a little bit more on that?
I just want to add to that. I completely agree. It's very difficult to say what the best model is, but I can tell you that you can't have a best model of any sort unless it is supported and well-funded. And so if you have an oversight agency that is constantly under threat of being defunded, that their budgets are being gutted just a little bit at a time, or that you have oversight agencies that are completely understaffed. If you have an oversight agency, you want them to be able to operate effectively. Otherwise, in the end, they will do more harm than good. A well-funded, well-trained agency is one that is going to actually be your best method of working with the community and making an effective relationship.
All right. So thanks. Next, I want to ask Mike Silva a question. I'll warn you, then at least you'll know the mic's coming your way. What would you say to this? Because I hear people say this a lot. Well, we have a chief. This is why our mayor, city managers hired the chief. The chief is responsible for making sure the officers do the right thing. Why not just let the chief do his or her job? Why do you need this civilian oversight thing?
Yeah, great question, and I think one that we've answered many times over in our community, and that is there is, no matter how well-intended your chief is, no matter how well-intended your command staff is, there are simply going to be times where that alternate perspective, that the lens through which the community views things is just different than what your chief executive or your command staff may be how they may be viewing it. And I go back to what I said earlier about this being a collaboration, and I think if you want this to be effective, you have to view it as a partnership. You have to in the way that Nick described that program, I think that's a perfect example of that. That's an initiative that you might have to, if you want to do it your agency, you're going to have to find funding to do it. You're going to have to identify the personnel to do it. Well, I've got this partner here sitting right next to me who's able to bring their own set of resources, their own skill set, an academic background, the ability to study the effectiveness of the program, and all of the chief executives in here appreciate this. It's not on your dime. You truly have a partner in the community that can help you to deliver the best possible product. So I think the more smart people you get in a room to address an issue, the better the outcome.
Well, and let me stick with you for a minute, and then I'll come back to Nick. So I know in your city, you actually have your independent police auditors sit on things like use of force panels. Like, how does that work, and why is that something that Tucson has decided was important to do?
Well, we looked at what we are required to do. We have by way of municipal code, we have a Citizens Police Advisory Review Board. We also have an independent police auditor. But I actually have a former colleague who's here in the room who was a big part of taking those things that we are required to do and moving them to the next level. We developed a critical incident review board, which we intentionally reached out to put the chair of our advisory review board onto the critical incident review board, because we wanted that perspective. We wanted the community to have a voice there, and the same thing is true with our force review board. The days of being insular and sort of doing those kinds of reviews in-house, they've long since passed us. And if we want to be transparent and build trust with our community, we need to have those folks involved in our processes. And I would also like to point out that from the training aspect of this is critical. So all of the folks that we have involved in these various review boards have go through extensive training at our police academy, and we've gone so far as to stick them in the same body-worn camera training as our officers go through. We've asked them to go and attend large portions of CIT training, mental health first aid. You get more value from these folks when you involve them in as many of your training opportunities. And last point,
Yeah.
I think it's absolutely critical that you rotate your command staff and your line officers into these review boards so that they can understand and appreciate the perspective of the community members that are on those boards.
Great. And Nick, did you want to?
Yeah, just briefly on your first point, in terms of the youth outreach work, I think we surely lent our resources and our time to help coordinate and bring that program together. But I think if you asked our chief in Denver what was the most important part or the most significant benefit associated with having that program originate with my office, it was that we have a significant amount of credibility with the community, and there were many communities that the department has had a very, very hard time reaching and connecting with and building trust with, and we were able to leverage the credibility that we have with those communities to help bring young kids into the fold and into the program and convince their parents that it was worthwhile for them to come and spend time with police officers. And so I think probably that was even more important than the resources that we gave to the project.
Great. All right. I guess one last thing I just kind of want to ask all of you, open it up, is very often people look at oversight and they think about, as you say, complaints and all of that. In this era of 21st century policing, we're hearing about a lot of different things: trust, legitimacy, procedural justice, but we're also hearing a lot about trauma. And one of the things that I know I think about a lot is the impact of psychological trauma on community members, on victims of crime, on police officers. And I'm just wondering if any of you have something you can add about how these traumatic events play out and how civilian oversight has played a role in communities moving forward in the wake of traumatic events that really impact more than just a person, but that it's really seen as something community-wide that gets people riled up.
Well, I guess I'll say we have a mediation program that we're very proud of that has been very successful for complaints that tend to begin from miscommunication between an officer and a community member. It's totally voluntary. We'll ask both parties if they'd like to sit down and discuss their interaction in a neutral location with an independent third-party mediator. And we have very, very good results from those mediations. What we've looked at doing is going beyond just the two people involved. We've looked at larger incidents that have had a broader impact on the community, incidents that may have sparked some kind of protest or some kind of public concern. And we've put together some mediations involving groups of people and police officers, or groups of people and police supervisors or command staff, to try to address their concern, to be proactive about addressing their concerns, in a neutral third-party location, really frankly, to deal with the trauma that they may have experienced or the trauma that they may have heard about, and give them an opportunity to talk about it with police officers who are willing to listen and willing to share their own experiences that they've had and maybe why the incident was difficult for them. So that's kind of a new thing in our office, but we're pretty excited about it, and we can see how it would be helpful in addressing some of those more traumatic incidents.
Great. I think Mike's over like that.
So in the spirit of that sort of, I'll call that a facilitator role, by small example, we had a protest that I think on a national scale would not register as being particularly significant. But during the protest, there was an elderly woman that was knocked down by one of our officers, and it became a flashpoint. It was very much very much driven along racial lines. We are a near majority Latino community, and it became a very, very significant issue. Our independent police auditor played a big role, an instrumental role in helping us put together a community forum that was pretty uncomfortable at times, and our chief took, I jokingly refer to it as the chief's piñata session, because it was not great, at least initially, but it really helped in giving those folks a voice, and our police auditor actually was, as I mentioned, was instrumental in putting that together and acting much like you are right now in a sort of moderator role. So invaluable, I think, in bridging those kind of gaps.
All right, great. So I know this is always risky with a room full of law enforcement people, but we really want to open this up to you. So I'm encouraged by the fact that not everybody's in the back half of the room. So, excuse me, I really do want to ask people here to just start off with some questions, whether you have questions for us about our work or the field. And I see a question here. There is a mic over there, so I think because they're recording the session, it would be great if people wouldn't mind going to the mic. Thank you.
Most cops tend to be pretty loud anyway.
I know, but I've learned from the AV people that doesn't always translate for the recording. So.
Good afternoon, good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Dr. Michelle Brackney. I'm the Chief of Police for Charlottesville, Virginia. I've had the fortune of the major agencies that I've been with. Pittsburgh was one of the first that had a civilian review board. And now Charlottesville has just formed its inaugural board. So 2 agencies, 2 oversights out of the 200. So one of my first questions is who, or when you're doing your studies, we've talked about oversight for the officers or the agency, we've talked about oversight for their internal affairs, but have you done any research on oversight for the oversight boards? In other words, who are placed on those, the impetus behind those placements? And one of the reasons I'm asking that question is Charlottesville has a very contentious relationship right now with the inaugural board, including public on-camera displays saying that they're after them, that they're going to take them down, and this is repeatedly by numerous members. So the second part of that is, how do we start to even repair or wrap around a relationship when it has gone national during our Unite the Right anniversary rallies, where our civilian review board members and advisory board members are already making public and national statements that the purpose that they're there is to target the officers, to go after the officers, and that the majority of them have all filed numerous complaints against the officers, which they have not been adjudicated to their satisfaction. So if you could help walk me through an inaugural board that's very contentious as we speak, and publicly so, since all eyes are always on Charlottesville, Virginia, and is mentioned daily in the news. So thank you.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you. And let us make sure we connect after this so we can talk more and work with you. So I'll say a little bit, and then I'll turn it over to the other panelists, the panelists up here. One thing I would say is that we want to be engaged with them. So we want to connect with that review board because we see things like this a lot. I was just about 2.5 weeks ago in Providence, Rhode Island, where it's nothing like the situation in Charlottesville, but after about 10 years, they revived their oversight board, and it was after community activists came together to push for it. I presented at their meeting and was immediately confronted by not the board members, but the activists who were like, they're not supposed to be neutral and impartial. They're here for us. And so it's a real challenge around expectation setting about what is the nature of oversight, that who is it for? And as I think people have said, it's for the community, which includes law enforcement. And sometimes that's a little bit of a tricky balance. But let me, again, I'll ask our panelists to address this in more detail, and then we will connect.
So it's a hard question and a very difficult situation. And one of the things I will say is that although each situation is a little different, there are those out there that can discuss how they've dealt with it in the past. Like, for instance, you mentioned Pittsburgh, and Beth Pittenger is an amazing example of someone who's seen a little bit of everything. And we do a lot of work to try and connect law enforcement and oversight agencies with other cities so that no one is having to spend the time reinventing the wheel. So I'll start there. Resources are one thing, but it also is a little overwhelming to think how you're going to solve that type of conflict that exists from the get-go. One of the things that some civilian oversight entities have done is they make sure that one of the first items on their agenda is to create a their own SOPs, so that they can make sure that what they're doing is working in a fair and consistent manner. I joke often with oversight agencies, although it's not particularly funny, that if you're doing your job right, 9 times out of 10, no one will be happy with you, whether it's the community or law enforcement. And that's really where civilian oversight needs to exist, in a neutral territory where they're doing their job in a way that benefits the greater community. And so having bylaws for the board, standard operating procedures that really lay out how you want to conduct yourself is very important. Now, when you're having those procedures put together by a very hostile group, that might not be beneficial at the get-go. But I will say, back to your question about trauma, I think one of the things is that it's not going to be a quick process. The trauma that exists on both sides in situations like that have spent generations building up, and a civilian review board is not going to be able to fix that in a couple of weeks or a couple of years properly, unfortunately, although I know everyone on both sides would like it to happen sooner rather than later. And so patience is part of that. And then also working with everyone so that everyone feels like they have a voice, like Nick mentioned earlier, being able to work with people and get a group of stakeholders who you can work with, the oversight, being the oversight agency, can work with to be able to communicate with the greater community and law enforcement. Because it doesn't sound like every time the Civilian Oversight Board is going to be able to do that.
Right. Yeah, if there's anyone else, quick.
Well, I'm also just curious, what kind of vetting process there was for those appointments. I said earlier that there's no best model, and I think that's true. But surely there should be multiple stakeholders at the table for the selection of the people who will sit on that body. In some jurisdictions, the mayor makes the appointments, and then the city council has a vetting process where the city council can ask, try and figure out, hey, is this person going to be fair-minded, or do they have any kind of bias or agenda? So it sounds like maybe, based on your shaking your head, there really wasn't vigorous shaking. Okay, vigorous. There wasn't a process there where you could kind of suss out and the public could figure out whether people were going to be going on with an agenda or fair-minded, and maybe that's where the weakness was in the creation of that body.
And one last thing, there are cities such as Atlanta that in their enabling legislation, they actually laid out not only that there were some quote-unquote at-large members, but that there were also very specific community organizations that would have a seat at the table, which then kind of helps make sure that there are many voices at the table and not just one in particular.
Right.
So something to think about.
And then before we go to our next question, I'll just say one of the things I've really been pushing in this world of oversight is procedural justice and legitimacy, that we have to absolutely follow those very same principles that we ask of our law enforcement agencies. And from what you've just said, it doesn't sound like that is happening yet in Charlottesville. So look forward to working with you to see how we can make it work for everybody. But please.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
My name's Tim Fitch, and I am the now former Chief of Police for St. Louis County. We had a little problem called Ferguson in 2014,
I think I've heard of it.
if you remember that.
Have a vague recollection.
And I've made the mistake. I'm running for St. Louis County Council, and one of the issues that we're having to deal with right now, community members are not happy with our Civilian Oversight Board. We've had civilian oversight in our department since 1955. Now, not only are they oversight of civilian complaints, but they are in charge of the police department. The civilians are.
Mm-hmm.
They hire the chief, they fire the chief. The community, they're not happy with that. What they want, the activists want, is they want to be the ones that make those decisions. So my question, it's not a statement, but my question is how do we convince these groups, we've tried, how do we convince these groups that they do have input on the members? The members of the 5 members of the Board of Police Commissioners are selected by the county executive, so the county mayor, or whatever you would call it. Their input on the selection of those members is when they vote or not for the county executive. They're not happy with that. I don't believe they'll be happy with that until they are in charge and they are making the decisions. How do we address that?
Well, that's an easy one. No,
We've tried education. We've tried inviting them to citizens academies and all the things. Don't want any part of it.
Yeah. Well, again, I'll start a little bit and then turn it over. I mean, clearly, that's unfortunately, it's not the most uncommon situation. This happens from time to time, and you, especially the police department that you've worked for or the county government, may not be able to convince some of those people, right? Because as we know, we have people that just believe policing is inherently illegitimate, that government is kind of illegitimate, and it often isn't going to be enough to say, well, you get to elect the county executive, and so that's your input. So on some level, it's going to be up to the county executive to figure out some mechanism to create legitimacy for his or her decisions. And with the support of law enforcement, with that kind of training and feedback, but it is not easy. And again, I think that we, in our work, try to help people to have those more realistic expectations, because we are, in oversight, part of the government. We are not external. And when people are onto this new idea of community control of policing, I understand that, but that's something that's most likely not going to happen inside most governmental structures. So I'm going to ask our panelists to comment on how do you work with the people who you can reach, who can hear it, within a governmental structure when you're facing these challenges of legitimacy?
It's a tough one.
It is. No, but I appreciate it because
well,
it's
and
a
their
real question.
underlying argument is the oversight board that's supervising the police department cannot be independent.
Right. So why don't you start, Mike, and then we'll maybe go to the independent monitor.
Yeah, no, I feel for you. Actually, I feel for you as well, Chief. Those are both.
I guess the question I'm still asking for is, have we talked about how do you have oversight of these boards as part of your studies and how effective they are when you're looking at the 9 different agencies? Because that's going to be legitimate as well. It's not how they work, but what is their level of accountability to the community as well?
Right. Right, and just in case it didn't get picked up, it's reiterating the question of what is the accountability? Who is oversight accountable to? What is the oversight of oversight, or the checks and balances on oversight? In addition to the question about that came from St. Louis County.
So I would just say that issue sort of speaks to a void where there is an element, I don't know how big an element, of that community that doesn't have a voice. So I made a joke to Nick about stacking the court, but what I mean when I say that is that if you have identified that void, then it's time, I think, to work with your electeds, whoever the political powers that exist. It's time to work to create an alternate mechanism, to create whether that's a committee or an advisory review board, but to now give them a voice by creating an alternate venue. If the existing one isn't working, and you have this constituency that doesn't feel as if they're being served, I think you have to find a way to address those. And maybe the existing construct is simply not going to ever fill that need.
Yeah, so certainly the environment that you described sounds like one in which nothing can productively get done because the relationships are so hostile. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that an increasingly new phenomenon is oversight of the overseers, and that takes form in a variety of ways. Clearly, if the relationships are not productive, the agency cannot be effective. And in certain jurisdictions, there are, for example, inspectors general who oversee and review the work that is being done of the oversight agency. So if based on temperament or just the nature of the relationships, if nothing is getting done, that should be picked up by those who are responsible for evaluating the work of the oversight agency itself. And then hopefully from that, some recommendations for remedying those ineffective practices can be brought about.
Right, and I'll just mention one good example is in Chicago, where you have this brand new oversight agency, the Chicago Office of Police Accountability. They also, at the same time, the city hired a deputy inspector general within the office of the IG, which has oversight of the police department and of the civilian office of police accountability. So they are not just kind of out there reporting only to the mayor, because I think sometimes our answer is, well, it's just like the police chief. We're accountable to the mayor or the city manager. So there are models developing where you actually have someone who's kind of an auditor, inspector general model who has that oversight and can make recommendations and findings and do investigations of the oversight agency as well, still within that municipal structure. But those are, again, to the extent an IG is independent, and I would argue IGs are truly independent in this country, it is a model that's developing.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I'm sort of reminded of those dolls that nest inside each one, and you could create an oversight body for the oversight body for the oversight body, and it could just go on and on forever. What in Denver, as I think Mike may have mentioned, there is an oversight body of mayoral appointees who review my performance as the independent monitor on an annual basis and are responsible by law for producing a report that goes to the city council and the mayor with information about how I've assessed complaints, the kind of outreach I've done, quantitative and qualitative assessments of my performance. That report is presented to the city council, and there's usually a meeting of the safety committee where there can be discussion about that report and about my performance, and so that creates a mechanism for, I guess, a political mechanism for the city council to be involved in reviewing my performance as the independent monitor. And I would think that it sounds like you probably need a political mechanism in your city to address concerns that have come up and have some kind of legislative body review what concerns have arisen about the the composition of the board so far, so that there can at least be discussion and dialogue about how to fix those issues.
All right, thank you.
And just one other thing. It's also very important to gauge the perceptions of the department that is being overseen, and folks who are in the public safety department to have them evaluate and report back on a qualitative basis what is working, what is not working, and so they can provide feedback and guidance for how that oversight agency should conduct itself.
All right, thank you. Yes, please.
Lyle Martin, Bakersfield, California, Chief of Police. First of all, thank you two for the work that you're trying to do, and we all sympathize with you from what has happened. But I'd like to take a couple of steps back, if we could. From my perspective, we tend to live in the USA, United States of amnesia. If it didn't happen 5 minutes ago or didn't happen to me, I really don't care. So my question is twofold. One, how do you get, because it appears there's a lot of work and time to be invested at the beginning of trying to do one of these committees with the training and the things that we're asking, those types of things. So how do you get those commitments, one? And two, you talked about being well-funded. So if the funding's coming from the governmental agency, how do you fight the legitimacy issues that we're talking about? Well, the chief's paying them. So of course they're gonna 99% of the time side with the department. So it's kind of twofold. For me, I'm finding it difficult when there's nothing going on. You can hold a community meeting, and I've got more staff there than I have citizens. But then when it happens, they all show up, and I ask for input, and I only get input for the 2 hour, which I did 2 weeks ago, the 2 hour piñata session. So my question is, how do we get that start? How do you get that commitment from people? Because these are professionals, so they want to get paid.
Okay, no, that's great. And I tried to jot these down if people forget. So, I think one thing I'll just say quickly in terms of funding, in my model in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I work for the city, but I report to the city manager. I do not report to the police chief. We're peers. My department is a little bit smaller. I have a few less tactical vehicles, but technically, I am a peer of the police chief, and we have a good relationship. So there's that piece. And also, many agencies are pushing for, and sometimes it's in ordinances, that the budget of the oversight agency is a percentage, maybe 0.5%, 2%, but something that, again, for an oversight agency, that will allow you to be robust, to have proper investigators, training, and staffing. And you're not part of the police department, but there's a dedicated funding formula so that it will have adequate funding. But again, but how do you get, our panelists here, how do you get that initial investment and commitment from the city, oversight people, and stakeholders to build it right from the beginning? And how do you create that legitimacy when it is part of the government?
Well, I guess I'll speak to your second question about independence and the perception of independence. And I think you need both. For this to work, you need both. For it to be helpful to your department, for it to help provide legitimacy to your department in the community, it needs to be both an independent entity and it needs to be perceived as an independent entity. If the public perceives that you, chief, are in control of the oversight board or the oversight entity, it will lose any value to you or to the community. So I would argue that from a budget perspective, it should not come out of your budget. It should come out of, the oversight body should not report to you. They should report to someone else, and it should come out of some other budget so that that perception becomes reality. I would just hate to see you lose the value of potentially of having an oversight body if it was perceived as being under your control. How do you get the resources to the table? I mean, is that a political question? How do you build the constituency or how do you build momentum for creating a body like this? What kind of an answer are you looking? Is it a tactical question?
Yeah, I'm looking at it from a functional question. It's not. I really don't have the political issues today. I mean, but. Hell, I'm here. It could be happening right now. But I'm just, from a functional standpoint, how do you get the people to buy in? I need you to go to an academy. I need you to go to these. You have to do all of this work before you can even actually do the work that you want to do. That's what I'm looking for. Just some best practices is how you got the buy-in. I mean, I've got great relationships with our UC and our community college, and so I can get release time for my academics. I've already got buy-in for that. But when you talk about the other entities that you want at the table, I mean, this is a huge commitment that I'm asking for somebody before I can even impanel a panel, if you will.
I know that in Indianapolis, the ordinance is written with very specific requirements. So you have 20 to, I can't remember the exact hours, I think it was 20 hours of training at the onset every year. In addition to agreeing to training as needed throughout the year, 16 hours of ride-alongs. So having it part of the legislation or ordinance that is in place, so that when people are appointed to the board, that they know that from the onset that is the commitment that must be made, with mechanisms in the ordinance to remove people who are unwilling to do the training that's necessary. And anybody who really wants to join a civilian review board with the assumption that they're doing something good for their community needs to understand that they're going to have to do something for their community. So I think that's really the only way at this point that we can convince people, and that's that there are commitments in the legislation and there are repercussions in it as well.
Right. And I'll just also mention on our website, www.nacole.org, we have a number of resources which include some documents which are pretty brief, but just like an outline of best practices in terms of training, the kinds of training that civilian oversight practitioners need, which is, and you can point people to that because we're not law enforcement, we're civilian oversight. And this is what we say people should be looking at for their training.
Okay, I'll make two quick more comments before I'll stop dominating the microphone. One, somebody's got to be pretty affluent to be able to commit those type in my community. So it's already going to have a, negative connotation. And again, I'm only looking from my perspective that, okay, you've got all the rich people on this board, that type of thing. And two, I just want to say thank you for looking at the cumulative trauma on both sides is the way I look at it, because, if cops are going to things over and over and over again, and we're not surprised when the flashpoint happens if we're not looking at police officer wellness as well as community wellness. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
In addition, your comment about the type of people who would have to serve on the board. So I will say that in my experience and with several of the cities, many of the cities that I've worked with as they've begun their training programs, actually it tends to be many of the people who serve on the boards would probably not be described as affluent. A lot of work is done to do the work outside of working hours, so that this is part of their volunteer work, and they're still able to carry the 40 to 50 hours a week that they're working. And so I know that's not the case in all communities, but that is really important, because you need that diversity, that economic diversity on the board, because someone that's living in one part of the community is having a very different experience with the police than someone that's living in another, and both of those perspectives need to be represented.
And then the last thing I'll just say to your final question is, in terms of input, I mean, people have said this to some degree. When Oversight's working well, that oversight agency can be a key part of helping you get input when it's not just, we've got the neighborhood sergeants meeting and people come out when there's a problem, but you can have this ongoing mechanism through the oversight that is getting that input and feeding it to the department in various ways, whether it's formal recommendations, informal consultations, and an environment where people can come and talk, not just to hit the piñata, but hopefully to share with people who they see as more sympathetic, because they often do, whether they ought to or not. So, and yes, sir.
Thank you. John Barbieri, Police Commissioner, Springfield, Massachusetts. Actually, I'm just going to speak in support of both of the former chiefs. To their point, I think that most chiefs here and police commissioners would tell you that disciplinary and personnel issues, community trust, two of the biggest headaches any chief has. I'm glad I'm not the only person aging prematurely due to those issues. But to the Bakersfield chief's point especially, unfortunately, we're not an affluent community. And the amount of hours that we require, because where there's poverty, there's crime. And where there's crime, there's police complaints. The amount of hours that we're asking these people to put in addition to the trainings, to come in, review the cases, to conduct the hearings. We have a civilian oversight board. It's a tremendous amount of hours, and what we get is people that are very altruistic, but they're also fairly wealthy. And, they have their own businesses, or some of them are stay-at-home moms, which is phenomenal. But it's hard. We have a fairly decent representation from the community, but it's hard. It's hard to get them on board for those. They're great folks, but it's hard to get them to commit for the hours and hours and hours of training, defensive tactics, CIT. So any review, please, would include some mechanism for the training portion, and how do we reward those people without making it look like we're buying them. And then to the Charlotte chiefs, we had decades of complete civilian oversight in Springfield. The Civilian Police Commission negotiated the contracts. They hired, they fired, they did everything but transfer. And it was finally removed in the early 90s. We had a financial control board come in and say you can't have an efficient organization if your CEO can't actually determine who should be rewarded and who should be punished. And the other issue is the political influence. So it is definitely that checks and balances, because obviously politicians, what they will tell you is they're advocating for people, but it's a control mechanism. And we definitely have to be concerned in regards to that. So any best practices, the Attorney General's oversight. I worked in IU many years. I put handcuffs on cops. I have no problem with that if they don't do their job. But I also saw the other side of it when we went before a civilian review board. I saw police officers that were in very controversial incidents that really appeared to do nothing wrong, that were unfairly punished. And then I saw police officers that did heinous acts, but that were politically connected, that were walked out the door with a pat on the back. We just cannot return to that era. So any best practices that will assist us into oversight of our control boards, just definitely required, and anything you could do with that checks and balances would be greatly appreciated, because I don't think there's a chief in the room that wouldn't like that headache to go away. And it's not that we're afraid to hand it over, it's we're afraid to hand over to another mechanism that'll be broken.
Right, right. So first of all, thank you for your comments, and I want to talk to you as well, because I was just out in Springfield a couple months ago and got to meet with your I think all but one of the members of your review board. And I'll just say quickly, we have said like 15 times, everybody is different. You guys have a pretty unusual and unique model where the members of the board actually act as the hearing officers for civil service hearings around discipline. And one of the challenges from speaking with your city solicitor, we had a couple really great conversations, is how to have a system where you've got civilians involved in this disciplinary system and it actually works. So you don't have either extreme, whether it's someone gets off because it's political, or even just that as civilians they look at this and they go, well, I guess that's okay, when the chief is saying, this guy's got to be out of here. And you've got the Civil Service Board, you've got the arbitration. So they've been working really hard to have more alignment so that the board members get training, get recommendations from the personnel folks who can do a survey of disciplinary recommendations in similar situations, and then present that both to the chief and to the Civilian Oversight Board, so that you don't have people coming at this from different directions. Because as all of you know better than me, if you got this person saying, oh, here's what we think, and this person says, no, we think it's over here, there's probably nothing is going to happen. So I take your points very seriously, and I know we are committed to continuing to do that. So I look forward to speaking with you more, coming out to Springfield and sitting down with you, so that we can also learn from your experience how, as we develop this work more and more around the country, and as we do see more oversight, it is done in a way that works for all of the stakeholders. Because again, if it doesn't work for the law enforcement agency, it's not going to work for the whole community. Let's see, we have 4 minutes left. I don't know if there's anything else that there's room for anyone else to say, but all right. So I think we're just going to take this opportunity to end 4 minutes early. We will stay up here. Thank you so much for coming to this session and for your questions. And most of all, thank you for your service. We appreciate it.